Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The Future of the American Negro by Booker T. Washington, Chapter 8, starting on page 200. This is the last chapter of this book. It's been an exciting ride as we've learned many things about Booker T. Washington and his view of industrial education.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Sister Ra and the elders listening with you. I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much. I respect and value you as you respect and value me. Thank you so much for all of your gifts and attention that you pay to this broadcast. Chapter 8. Before ending this volume, I have deemed it wise and fitting to sum up in the following chapter all that I have attempted to say in the previous chapters, and to speak at the same time a little more definitely about the Negro's future and his relation to the white race. All attempts to settle the question of the Negro in the South by his removal from this country have so far failed, and I think that they are likely to fail. The next census will probably show that we have about 10 millions of Negroes in the United States. About 8 millions of these are in the southern states. We have almost a nation within a nation. The Negro population within the United States lacks but 2 millions of being as large as the whole population of Mexico. It is nearly twice as large as the population of the Dominion of Canada. It is equal to the combined populations of Switzerland, Greece, Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, Uruguay, Santo Domingo, Paraguay, and Costa Rica. When we consider in connection with these facts that the race has doubled itself since its freedom and is still increasing, it hardly seems possible for anyone to consider seriously any scheme of emigration from America as a method of solution of our vexed race problem. At most, even if the government were to provide the means, but a few 100,000 would be transported each year. The yearly increase in the population would more than overbalance the number transplanted, even if it did not. The time required to get rid of the Negro by this method would perhaps be 50 or 75 years. The idea is chimerical. Some have advised that the Negro leave the South and take up residence in the northern states. I question whether this would leave him any better off than he is in the South when all things are considered. It has been my privilege to study the condition of our people in nearly every part of America, and I say, without hesitation, that with some exceptional cases, the Negro is at his best in the southern states. Greetings, Forecast. How are you tonight? Thanks for tuning in. While he enjoys certain privileges in the North that he does not have in the South, when it comes to the matter of securing property, enjoying business opportunities, and employment, the South presents a far better opportunity than the North. And that's because of unions and white people freezing Black people out of the employment market, as well as the lack of true land mass, large masses of land in the northern states. Few colored men from the South are as yet able to stand up against the severe and increasing population and competition that exists in the North. It is to say, of the unfriendly influence of labor organizations, which in some way prevents Black men in the North, as a rule, from securing employment in skilled labor occupations. Another point of great danger for the colored man who goes north is in the matter of morals, owing to the numerous temptations by which he finds himself surrounded. He has more ways in which he can spend his money than in the South, but fewer avenues of employment are open to him. So you can go and buy things in the North, but you don't really have a way to go make money. The fact that at the North, the Negro is confined to almost one line of employment often tends to discourage and demoralize the strongest who go from the South and make them an easy prey to temptation. A few years ago, I made an examination into the condition of a settlement of Negroes who left the South and went to Kansas 20 years ago, when there was quite a good deal of excitement in the South concerning e-migration to the West. This settlement, I found, which was much below the standard of that similar to the number of our people in the South. The only conclusion, therefore, it seems to me, which anyone can reach, is that the Negroes as a mass are to remain in the southern states. As a race, they do not want to leave the South, and the southern white people do not want them to leave. We must therefore find some basis of settlement that will be constitutional, just, manly, that will be fair to both races in the South and to the whole country. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. This cannot be done in a day, a year, or any short period of time. We can, it seems to me, with the present light, decide upon a reasonably safe method of solving the problem and turn our strength and effort in that direction. In doing this, I would not have the Negro deprived of any privilege guaranteed to him by the Constitution of the United States. It is not best for the Negro that he relinquish any of his constitutional rights. It is not best for the Southern white man that he should. In order that we may, without loss of time or effort, concentrate our forces in a wise direction, I suggest what seems to me and many others the wisest policy to be pursued. I have reached these conclusions by experience of my own observations and experience. After 18 years of direct contact with the leading and influential colored and white men in most parts of the country. But I wish to first mention some elements of danger in the present situation, which all who desire the permanent welfare of both races in the South should be carefully considered first. First, there is danger that a certain class of impatient extremists among the Negroes who have little knowledge of the actual conditions of the South may do the entire race injury by attempting to advise their brethren in the South to resort to armed resistance or to the use of a torch in order to secure justice. All intelligent and well considered discussions of any important question or condemnation of any wrong, both in the North and the South, from the public platform and through the press, must be commended and encouraged. But ill considered, incendiary utterances from Black men in the North will tend to add to the burdens of our people in the South rather than relieve them. Second, another danger in the South, which should be guarded against, is that the whole white South, including the wide, conservative, law abiding element, may find itself represented before the bar of public opinion by the mob, or a lawless element which gives expressions to its feelings and a tendency in a manner of that advertises the South throughout the world. So he's talking about how the image of the South. To those, too often, those who have no sympathy with such disregard of law are either silent or fail to speak in a sufficiently emphatic manner to offset any large degree the unfortunate reputation which the lawless have too often made for many portions of the South. So they were lynching people, and that had gotten out to the mass public, and that was the traditional reputation and how the South was known to have handled their Negro problem. Third, no race or people ever got up on its feet without severe and constant struggle, often in the face of the greatest discouragement. While passing through the present trying period of its history, there is danger that a large and valuable element of the Negro race may become discouraged in the effort to better its condition. Every possible influence should be exerted to prevent this. So they should stop discouraging Black people from working and trying to obtain opportunities for themselves. Fourth, there is a possibility that harm may be done to the South and to the Negro by exaggerated newspaper articles which are written near the scene or in the midst of specially aggravating occurrences of lynchings. Often these reports are written by newspaper men who give the impression that there is a race conflict throughout the South and that all Southern white people are opposed to the Negro's progress, overlooking the fact that while in some sections there is trouble, in most parts of the South there is, nevertheless, a very large measure of peace, goodwill, and mutual helpfulness. In this same relation, much can be done to retard the progress of the Negro by a certain class of Southern white people who, in the midst of excitement, speak or write in a manner that gives the impression that all Negroes are lawless, untrustworthy, and shiftless. An example, as as an example, a Southern writer not long ago in communication with the New York Independent writes, even in small towns, the husband cannot venture to leave his wife alone for an hour at night. At no time, in no place, is the white woman safe from the insults and assaults of these creatures. End quote. These statements, I presume, represented the feelings and the conditions that existed at the time they were written in one community or one county in the South. But thousands of Southern white men and women would be ready to testify that this is not the condition throughout the South, nor throughout any one state. So they had a problem with the press because their propaganda machine was against the Negro. Fifth, under the next head, I would like to mention that owing to the lack of school opportunities for the Negro in rural districts in the South, there is danger that ignorance and idleness may increase to the extent of giving the Negro race a reputation for crime, and that immorality may eat its way into the moral fiber of the race so as to retard its progress for many years. In judging the Negro in this regard, we must not be too harsh. We must remember that it has only been within the last 34 years that the Black father and mother have had the responsibility and consequently the experience of training their own children. They have not reached perfection in one generation with the obstacles that parents have been compelled to overcome. Is not to be wondered at all. Six, as a final source of danger to be guarded against, I would mention my fear that while that some of the white people in the South may be led to feel that the way to settle the race problem is to repress the aspirations of the Negro by legislation of a kind that confers certain legal or political privileges upon an ignorant and poor white man and withholds those same privileges from a Black man in the same condition. Such legislation injures and retards the progress of both races. It is an injustice to the poor white man because it takes from him the incentive to secure education and property as prerequisites for voting. He feels that because he is a white man, regardless of his possessions, a way will be found for him to vote. I would label all such measures laws to keep the poor white man in ignorance and poverty. As the Talladega News Reporter, a Democratic newspaper of Alabama, recently said, but it is a weak cry when the white man asks odds on intelligence over the Negro, when nature has already handicapped the African in the race for knowledge. The cry of the boasted Anglo-Saxon is still further odds seems babyish. What wonder that the world looks on in surprise, if not disgust. It cannot help but say, if our contention be true that the Negro is an inferior race, that the odds ought to be on the other side if they are to be given. And why not? No, the only thing to do, the only thing that will stand the test of time is to do right, exactly right. Let come what will. And that right thing, as it seems to me, is to place a fair educational qualification before every citizen, one that is self-testing and not dependent upon the wishes of weak men, letting all who pass the test stand in the proud ranks of the American voter, whose votes shall be counted as cast, and whose sovereign will shall be maintained as law by all the powers that be. Nothing short of this will ever do. Every exemption, on whatsoever ground, is an outrage that can only rob some legitimate voter of his rights. Booker T. Washington was in favor of poll tests. That's what you need to remember. He was in favor of poll tests. Such Laws as have been made, as an example in Mississippi with the understanding clause, hold out a temptation for the election officer to perjure and degrade himself too by deciding that the ignorant white man does understand the Constitution when it is read to him and that the ignorant black man does not. By such a law, the state not only commits a wrong against its black citizens, it injures the morals of its white citizens by conferring such a power upon any white man who may happen to be a judge of elections. Such laws are hurtful, again, because they keep alive in the heart of the black man the feeling that the white man means to oppress him. The only safe way out is to set a high standard as a test of citizenship and require blacks and whites alike to come up to do it. When this is done, both will have a higher respect for the election laws and those who make them. I do not believe that with his centuries of advantage over the Negro and opportunity to acquire property and education as prerequisites for voting, that the average white man in the South desires that any special law be passed to give him advantage over the Negro who has had only a little more than 30 years in which to prepare himself for citizenship. In this relation, another point of danger is that the Negro has been made to feel that it is his duty to oppose continually the Southern white man in politics, even in matters where no principle is involved, and that he is only loyal to his own race and acting in a manly way when he is opposing him. Such a policy has proved most hurtful to both races. Where it is a matter of principle, where a question of right or wrong is involved, I would advise the Negro to stand by principle at all hazards. A Southern white man has no respect for or confidence in a Negro who acts merely for policy's sake. But there are many cases, and the number are growing, where the Negro has nothing to gain and much to lose by opposing the Southern white man in many matters that relate to the government. Under these 6 heads, I believe I have stated some of the main points which all high-minded white men and black men, North and South, will agree need our most earnest and thoughtful consideration if we would hasten and not hinder the progress of our country. As to the policy that should be pursued in a larger sense, on this subject, I claim to possess no superior wisdom or unusual insight. I may be wrong. I may be in some degree right. In the future, more than the past, we want to impress upon the Negro the importance of identifying himself more closely with the interests of the South, the importance of making himself part of the South and at home in it. Heretofore, for reasons which were natural and for which no one is especially to blame, the colored people have been too much like a foreign nation residing in the midst of another nation. If William Lloyd Garrison, Wendell Phillips, and L. George Stearns were alive today, I feel sure that each one of them would advise the Negroes to identify their interests as far as possible with those of the Southern white man, always with the understanding that this should be done where no question of right or wrong is involved. In no other way, it seems to me, can we get a foundation for peace and progress. He who advises against this policy will advise the Negro to do that which no people in history have succeeded, would have done, which no people in history who have succeeded have done. So to do the impossible. The white man, North or South, who advises the Negro against it, advises him to do that which he himself has not done. The bedrock upon which every individual rests his chances of success in life is securing the friendship and confidence, the respect of his next door neighbor, of the little community in which he lives. Almost the whole problem of the Negro in the South rests itself upon the fact as to whether the Negro can make himself of such indispensable service to his neighbor and the community that no one can fill his place better in the body politic. There is at present no other safe course for the black man to pursue. If the Negro in the South has a friend in his white neighbor and is still a larger number of friends in his community, he has a protection and a guarantee of his rights that will be more potent and more lasting than any of our federal Congress, than any right our federal Congress or any outside power can confer. In a recent editorial, the London Times, in discussing affairs of the Transvaal, South Africa, where Englishmen have been denied certain privileges by the Boers, it is said, England is too sagacious not to prefer a gradual reform from within, even should it be less rapid than most of us might wish, to the most sweeping redress of grievances imposed from without. Our object is to obtain fair play for the outlanders, but the best way to do it is to enable them to help themselves. So, with all of this outside agitation, the best thing to do is for them to help themselves. The forecast says it doesn't sound like most of his ideas aged well. And no, they didn't age well. This policy, I think, is equally safe when applied to the conditions of the South. The foreigner who comes to America as soon as possible identifies himself in business, education, politics, and sympathy with the community in which he settles. So he aligns himself in business, education, politics, and sympathy with the community in which he settles. As I have said, we have a conspicuous example of this in the case of the Jews, but the Jews were able to assimilate into whiteness because they were just a different kind of white people. And Black people have different problems, okay, guys? Never think that assimilation and amalgamation and integration are helpful things to you if you want to remain Black. If you want to become white, then all you have to do is continue race mixing and you become white over generations. And they'll look back and see some Black ancestor that worked really hard to become white, which is the objective of most white people. But when we're talking about the Jews and the Irish, and even to this day, the Latinas and the Hispanics and the Arabs, and the Europeans that are coming in now, those are just all different admixtures of white people, and they're on the whiteness scale. And the objective here is to integrate, their objective is to get you to integrate into whiteness to the exclusion of Black. Also, the Negro in Cuba has practically settled the race question there because he has made himself a part of Cuba in thought and action. What I have tried to indicate not only be accomplished by any sudden revolution of methods, but it does seem that the tendency more and more should be in this direction. If a, if a practical example is wanted in the direction that I favor, I will mention one. The North sends thousands of dollars into the South each year for the education of the Negro. The teachers in most of the academic schools in the South are supported by the North or Northern men and women in the highest Christian culture and most unselfish devotion. The Negro owes them a debt of gratitude which can never be repaid. The various missionary societies in the North have done work which, in a large degree, has been the salvation of the South, and the result will appear in future generations more than this. We have now reached the point in the South where I believe that great good condition could be accomplished by changing the attitude of the white people toward the Negro and the Negro toward the whites. If a few white teachers of high character would take an active interest in the work of these high schools. Can this be done? Yes. The medical school connected with Shaw University at Raleigh, North Carolina, has from the first had its instructors and professors almost exclusively Southern white doctors who reside in Raleigh, and they have given the highest satisfaction. This gives the people of Raleigh the feeling that this is their school and not something located in, but not a part of, the South. In Augusta, Georgia, the Payne Institute, one of the best colleges for our people, is officered and taught almost wholly by Southern white men and women. The Presbyterian Theological School of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, has all Southern white men as instructors. Some time ago, at the Calhoun School of Alabama, one of the leading white men in the country was given an important position in the school. Since then, the feeling of the white people in the county has greatly changed toward the school. So, what he's saying is that you can put white people in a place of leadership over Black people in Black institutions. The problem with that is that they get to set and guide the educational and academic course, and they get to direct the studies of those Black people. So they send you off on dummy missions, and you have to wind up writing ridiculous things to get your doctorate or your master's degree there for your thesis statements. You wind up searching out things that have no relevance to what the real work is that you want to do. So, again, for as long as you put the white people in control, you're putting yourself at a loss. We must admit the stern fact that at the present, the Negro, through no choice of his own, is living among another race which is far ahead of him in education, property, experience, and favorable condition. Further, that the Negro's present condition makes him dependent upon the white people for most of the things necessary to sustain life, as well as for his common school education. In all history, those who have possessed the property and intelligence have exercised the greatest control over government, regardless of color, race, or geographical location. This being the case, how can the Black man in the South improve his present condition? And does the Southern white man want him to improve it? The Negro in the South has within its power, if he properly utilizes the force of hand, to make himself such a valuable factor in the life of the South that he will not have to seek privileges, they will be freely conferred upon him. To bring this about, the Negro must begin at the bottom and lay a sure foundation and not be lured by any temptation into trying to rise on a false foundation. While the Negro is laying this foundation, he will need help, sympathy, and simple justice, all of which are denied him. All of these things, help, sympathy, and simple justice at the time this was written were all denied Black people. Progress by any other method will be but temporary and superficial, and the latter end of it will be worse than the beginning. American slavery was a great curse to both races, and I would be the last to apologize for it. But in the presence of God, I believe that slavery laid the foundation for for the solution to the problem that is now before us in the South. Oh my God, was Booker T. Washington one of them people that felt like if it wasn't for slavery, you would be somewhere in Africa naked praying to a tree? That statement sounds like he might be. Again, in the presence of God, I believe that slavery laid the foundation for the solution to the problem which is now before us in the South. During slavery, the Negro was taught every trade, every industry that constitutes the foundation for making a living. Now, if on this foundation, laid in a rather crude way, it is true, but a foundation nonetheless, we can gradually build and improve. The future for us is bright. So if we can build on this foundation of slavery, which taught us organized trades in the white man's world and in the Western perspective of things, then we would be able to have a bright future. That's ridiculous because they took us from the environment where we were already thriving. We had businesses, civilizations, and multiple golden ages before we came to America. The forecast says, yeah, it sounded like it. Why would he apologize for slavery? He was the victim born into it. Exactly. But let's continue. Let me be more specific. Agriculture is or has been the basic industry of nearly every race or nation that has succeeded. The Negro got a knowledge of this during slavery. Hence, in a large measure, he is in possession of this industry in the South today. The Negro can buy land in the South, as a rule, wherever the white man can buy it. That's not true. And at very low prices. Now, since the bulk of our people already have a foundation in agriculture, they are at their best when living in the country engaged in agricultural pursuits. Plainly, when the best thing, plainly, then, the best thing, the logical thing is to turn the larger part of our strength in a direction that will make the Negro among the world's most skilled agricultural people. The man who has learned to do something better than anyone else has learned to do a common thing in an uncommon manner, is the man who is powerful and influential, that no adverse circumstances can take from him. The Negro who can make himself so conspicuous as a successful farmer, a large taxpayer, a wise helper of his fellow man, as to be placed in a position of trust and honor, whether the position be political or otherwise, by natural selection, is 100-fold more secure in that position than one placed there by mere outside force or pressure. That's a lie, because he's saying that if you work hard to get into these different positions, that you'll be more valuable even as a Black person. And he's totally ignoring the question of race prejudice, because he felt like race prejudice was a small thing, a small thing to be overcome, because he had been favored. He was one of the favorite pets of white people. Now, Booker T. Washington did some other things, and they say he funded some projects in schools in Africa, and he did some other things. But this is the content that he was publishing and producing and putting out in America to be consumed by the masses here. And this is ridiculous because what he's saying is that if you just held your hat in hand and worked hard, even as a Black person, you could come up. And we didn't have those same opportunities. And we didn't have that same chance. We couldn't buy land because they put deeds into the land and clauses into the deeds that said this land cannot be sold to Black people. So, no, just because the land was available doesn't mean we could buy it. Okay. All right. I'm going to keep reading. I know a Negro, the Honorable Isaiah T. Montgomery in Mississippi, who is the mayor of a town. It is true that this town at present is composed almost wholly of Negroes. Mr. Montgomery is mayor of this town because his genius, thrift, and foresight have created the town, and he is held and supported in his office by a charter granted by the state of Mississippi and by the vote and public sentiment of the community in which he lives. Let us help the Negro by every means possible to acquire such an education in farming, dairying, stock raising, horticulture, etc., as will enable him to become a model in these respects and place him near the top in these industries, and the race problem would in large part be settled or at least stripped of many of its most perplexing elements. This policy would also tend to keep the Negro in this country in smaller towns where he succeeds best and stop the influx into large cities where he does not succeed so well. The race, like the individual, that produces something of superior worth that has a common human interest, makes a permanent place for itself and is bound to be recognized. At a county fair in the South not long ago, I saw a Negro awarded the first prize by a jury of white men over white competitors for the production of the best specimen of Indian corn. Every white man at the fair seemed to be pleased and proud of the achievement. One moment, I'm having some technical difficulties. Every white man at this fair seemed to be pleased and proud of the achievement of this Negro because it was apparent that he had done something to add to the wealth and comfort of the people of both races in that county. At the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in Alabama, we have a department devoted to training men in the science of agriculture. Plug Tuskegee. Remember, he's always trying to plug Tuskegee. But what we are doing is small compared to what should be done at Tuskegee and at other educational centers. In a material sense, the South is still an undeveloped country. While race prejudice is strongly exhibited in many districts, in the matter of business, of commercial and industrial development, there is very little obstacle in the Negro's way. The Negro who produces or has for sale something that the community wants customers among white people as well as Black people. A Negro can borrow money from the bank with an equal security as readily as a white man can. I don't believe that that's true either because they had credit and they had letters of credit that they would issue to white men that they would not issue to Black people, because if a Negro could borrow money at the bank with equal security as readily as a white man could, there wouldn't have been sharecroppers, right? Because it would have made more sense to go into business for yourself versus going into debt. The forecast says this is why people like Ida B. Wells used to some call him out. Some of what he said was problematic. It was very problematic. A bank in Birmingham, Alabama, that has now existed 10 years is officered and controlled wholly by Negroes. This bank has white borrowers and white depositors. A graduate of the Tuskegee Institute keeps a well appointed grocery store in Tuskegee, and he tells me that he sells about as many goods to that of one race as to the other. What I have said of the opening that awaits the Negro in the direction of agriculture is almost equally true of mechanics, manufacturing, and all domestic arts. The field is before him and right about him. Will he occupy it? Will he cast down his bucket where he is? Will his friends north and south encourage him and prepare him to occupy it? Every city in the South, for example, would give support to a first class architect or house builder or contractor of our race. The architect and contractor would not only receive support, but through his example, numbers of young colored men would learn such trades as carpentry, brick masonry, plastering, painting, etc., and the race would be put into a position to hold on to many of the industries which it is now in danger of losing because in too many cases brains, skill, and dignity are not imparted to the common occupations of life that are about his very door. He has a point there because right now we have a shortage of skilled labor in our fields, in different fields, because first of all, they took VOTEC out of the high schools. And so those occupations aren't even offered to our young people anymore. But if you have a job or an industry that is attached to food, clothing, shelter, and death, then you have a job that is consistent because everybody needs somewhere to eat. They need something to eat, somewhere to live, something to wear, and when they die, something has to happen to their body. So those four industries are industries that you can always find a job in. If you get apprenticeships in those different fields, then you have an opportunity to move about and make money. But those are just four industries. You got logistics and transportation, you got wholesale versus retail, you got the mechanics, the building and repair of the trucks. So you have so many different industries that are available for work in those areas that you can just pick something and specialize in that one thing and you can have a greater opportunity. That's why they took the VOTEC and the trade schools out of our schools because they wanted our youth to not have anything. The forecast says it would be better if he was saying doing business among ourselves and do for ourselves on our own. It would be better if he were saying that. But that's not what he's saying, and that's what's so frustrating. This is our last Booker T. Washington book for a while. Any individual or race that does not fit itself to occupy in the best manner the field or service that is right about it will sooner or later be asked to move on and let someone else occupy it. But it is asked, would you confine the Negro to agriculture, mechanics, and domestic arts, etc.? Not at all. But along the lines that I have mentioned is where the stress should be laid just now for many years to come. You hear that? He wouldn't limit us to these hardworking fields, but he's saying that for years to come, for many years to come, we should stress working in these areas. We will need and must have many teachers and ministers, some doctors and lawyers and statesmen. But these professional men will have the constituency or a foundation from which to draw support just in proportion as the race prospers along the economic lines that I have mentioned. During the first 50 or 100 years of the life of any people, are not the economic occupations always given the greater attention? This is not only the historic, but I think the common sense view. If this generation will lay the material foundation, it will be the quickest and surest way for the succeeding generation to succeed in the cultivation of the fine arts and to surround itself even with some of the luxuries of life if desired. There's some truth to that, but you have to remember that a generation does have to sacrifice. But he was saying for some 50 to 100 years, people would be stuck in these fields of work. 50 to 100 years is a ridiculously long amount of time to say you stay in this servile position, and then maybe potentially in a few generations you can afford to go into getting some of the luxuries of life if desired. What the race now needs most, in my opinion, is a whole army of men and women well trained to lead and at the same time infuse themselves into agriculture, mechanics, domestic employment, and business. As to the mental training that these educated leaders should be equipped with, I should say give them all the mental training and culture that the circumstances of individuals will allow. The more, the better. No race can permanently succeed until its mind is awakened and strengthened by the ripest thought. But I would constantly have kept it in the thoughts of those who are educated in books at a large proportion of those who are educated should be so trained in hand that they can bring this mental strength and knowledge to bear upon the physical conditions in the South, which I have tried to emphasize. Frederick Douglass of sainted memory once, in addressing his race, used these words: "We are to prove that we can better our own condition. One way to do this is to accumulate property." This may sound to you like a new gospel. You have been accustomed to hear that money is the root of all evil, or etc. On the other hand, property, or money, if you please, will purchase for us the only condition by which any people can rise to the dignity of genuine manhood. For without property, there can be no leisure. Without leisure, there can be no thought. Without thought, there can be no invention. And without invention, there can be no progress. And those are the words of, Frederick Douglass. The Negro should be taught that material development is not an end, but simply a means to an end. As Professor W.E.B. Du Bois puts it, the idea should not be simply to make men carpenters, but to make carpenters men. The Negro has a highly religious temperament, but what he needs more and more is to be convinced of the importance of weaving his religion and morality into practical affairs of daily life. This is where they get the idea that we're the moral compass of the world, and they sell us on that propagandized idea. But I don't think that we take on that responsibility because unfortunately they have weaponized our compassion against us. And so they use that to keep us in a degraded state. But anyway, Equally, as much does he need to be taught to put much intelligence into his labor that he will see dignity and beauty in occupation and love it for its own sake. The Negro needs to be taught that more of the religion that manifests itself in his happiness in the prayer meeting should make practical in the performance of his daily task. The man who owns a home and is in possession of the elements by which he is sure of making a daily living has a great aid to a moral and religious life. What bearing will all this have upon the Negro's place in the South as a citizen and in the enjoyment of privileges which our government confers? To state in detail just what place the black man will occupy in the South as a citizen when he has developed in the direction named is beyond the wisdom of anyone. Much will depend upon the sense of justice which can be kept alive in the breast of the American people. Almost as much will depend upon the good sense of the Negro himself. The question, I confess, does not give me the most concern now. The most important and pressing question is, will the Negro, with his own help and that of his friends, take advantage of the opportunities that now surround him? When he has done this, I believe that speaking of his future in general terms, he will be treated with justice, will be given the protection of law, and will be given the recognition in a large measure which his usefulness and ability warrant. If 50 years ago anyone had predicted that the Negro would have received the recognition and honor which individuals have already received, he would have been laughed at as an idle dreamer. Time, patience, and constant achievement are great factors in the rise of a race. I do not believe that the world ever takes a race seriously in its desire to enter into the control of the government of a nation in any large degree until a large number of individual members of that race have demonstrated beyond question their ability to control and develop individual business enterprises. What white people had to go through that process in white society. When a number of Negroes rise to the point where they own and operate the most successful farms, are among the largest taxpayers in their county, are moral and intelligent, I do not believe that in many portions of the South, such men will long be denied the right of saying by their votes how they prefer their property to be taxed, and in choosing those who are to make and administer laws. In a certain town in the South recently, I was on the street in the company with the most prominent Negro in the town. While we were together, the mayor of that town sought out the black man and said, "Next week, we are going to vote on the question of issuing bonds to secure waterworks for this town. You must be sure to vote on the day of the election." The mayor did not suggest whether he must vote yes or no. He knew from the very fact that this Negro man owned nearly a block of the most valuable property in the town that he would cast a safe, wise vote on this important proposition. The elites and certain groups of people are all educated the same way. And if they're educated in the same manner, they don't have to be told how to vote. They vote in the interest of each other because they've been told what's in their best interest. Okay? This white man knew that because of this Negro's property interests in the city, he would cast his vote in the way that would benefit every white and black citizen in the town and not be controlled by the influences 1,000 miles away. But a short time ago, I read letters from nearly every prominent white man in Birmingham, Alabama, asking the Reverend W.R. Pettiford, a Negro, to be appointed to a certain important federal office. What is the explanation of this? Well, Mr. Pettiford, for 9 years, has been the president of the Negro Bank in Birmingham, to which I have alluded. During these 9 years, these white citizens have had the opportunity of seeing Mr. Pettiford manage successfully a private business and that he has proven himself a conservative, thoughtful citizen, and they were willing to trust him in a public office. Such individual examples will have to be multiplied until they become the rule rather than the exception. While we are multiplying these examples, the Negro must keep a strong and courageous heart. He cannot improve his condition by any shortcut course or by artificial methods. Above all, he must not be deluded into the temptation of believing that his condition can be permanently improved by a mere battledore and shuttlecock, or words, or by any process of mere mental gymnastics or oratory alone. What is desired, along with a logical defense of his cause, are deeds, results, multiplied results in the direction of building himself up so as to leave no doubt in the minds of anyone of his ability to succeed. An important question is often asked is an important question that is often asked is, does the white man of the South want the Negro to improve his present condition? I say yes. From the Montgomery, Alabama Daily Advertiser, I clipped the following in reference to the closing of a colored school in a town in Alabama. Eufaula, May 25th, 1899. The closing exercises of the city colored public school were held at St. Luke's AME Church last night and were witnessed by a large gathering including many whites. The recitations by the pupils were excellent, and the music was also an interesting feature. The Reverend R.T. Pollard delivered the address, which was quite an able one, and the certificates were presented by Professor T.L. McCoy White of the Sanford Street School. The success of the exercises reflect great credit upon the Professor S.M. Murphy, the principal, who enjoys a deservedly good reputation as a capable and efficient educator. I quote this report not because it is the exception, but because such marks of interest in the education of the Negro on the part of the Southern white people can be seen almost every day in the local papers. Why should white people, by their presence, words, and many other things, encourage the black man to get an education if they do not desire him to improve his condition? The Payne Institute in Augusta, Georgia is an excellent institution to which I have already referred, is supported almost wholly by Southern White Methodist Church. The Southern White Presbyterians support a theological school at Tuscaloosa, Alabama, for Negroes. For a number of years, the Southern White Baptists have contributed toward Negro education. Other denominations have done the same. If these people do not want the Negro educated to a high standard, there is no reason why they should act the hypocrite in these matters. The barbarous as some of the lynchings in the South have been, Southern white men here and there, as well as newspapers, have spoken out strongly against lynching. I quote from the address of Reverend Mr. Vance of Nashville, Tennessee, delivered before the National Sunday School Union in Atlanta not long since as an example. And yet, as I stand here tonight, a Southerner, speaking from my section and addressing an audience from all sections, there is one foul blot upon the fair fame of the South, at the bare mention of which the heart turns sick and the cheek is crimsoned with shame. I want to lift my voice tonight in a loud and long and indignant protest against the awful horror of mob violence, which the other day reached the climax of its madness and infamy as a black and brutal and barbarous as can be found in the annals of human crime. Continuing. I have a right to speak on the subject and I propose to be heard. The time has come for every lover of the South to set the might of an angered and resolute manhood against the shame and peril of the lynch demon. These people, whose fiendish glee taunts their victim as his flesh crackles in the flames, do not represent the South. I have not a syllable of apology for the sickening crime they meant to avenge. But it is high time we were learning that lawlessness is no remedy for crime. For one, I dare to believe that the people of my section are able to cope with crime, however treacherous and defiant through their courts of justice. And I plead for the masterful sway of a righteous and exalted public sentiment that shall class lynch law in the category with crime. End quote. It is a notable and praiseworthy fact that no Negro educated in any of our larger institutions of learning in the South has been charged with any of the recent crimes connected with assaults upon females. Because remember, lynching was only supposed to be the punishment for rape. If we go on making progress in the directions that I have tried to indicate, more and more the South will be drawn to one course. As I have already said, it is for the best interest of the white race of the South that the Negro be deprived of any privilege guaranteed him by the Constitution of the United States. This would put upon the South a burden under which no government could stand and prosper. Every article of our federal Constitution was placed there with a view of stimulating and encouraging the highest type of citizenship. To permanently tax the Negro without giving him the right to vote as fast as he qualifies himself in education and property for voting would work to the alienation of the affections of the Negro, some of the states in which he lives, and would be the reversal of the fundamental principles of government for which our states have stood. In other ways than this, the injury would be as great to the white man as to the Negro. Taxation without the hope of becoming a voter would take away from one third of the citizens of the Gulf states their interest in government and their stimulant to become taxpayers or to secure education, and thus to be able and willing to bear their share of the cost of education and government, which now weighs so heavily upon the white taxpayers of the South. The more the Negro is stimulated and encouraged, the sooner he will be able to bear a larger share of the burdens of the South. We have recently had before us an example in the case of Spain of a government that left a large portion of its citizens in ignorance and neglected their highest interests. As I have said elsewhere, there is no escape through law of man or God from the inevitable. The laws of changelessness, justice bind oppressor with oppressed, and close as sin and suffering joined, we march to fate abreast. Nearly 16 millions of hands will aid you in pulling up the load upward, or they will pull against you the load downward. We shall constitute 1/3 and more of the ignorance and crime of the South, or 1/3 of its intelligence and progress. We shall contribute 1/3 to the business and industrial prosperity of the South, or we shall prove a veritable body of death, stagnating, depressing, retarding every effort to advance the body politic. My own feeling is that the South will gradually reach the point where it will see the wisdom and justice of enacting an educational or property qualification, or both, for voting that shall be made to apply honestly to both races. The industrial development of the Negro in connection with education and Christian character will help to hasten this end. When this is done, we shall have a foundation, in my opinion, upon which to build a government that is honest and that will be honest and that will be in a high degree satisfactory to both races. I do not suffer myself to take too optimistic a view of the conditions in the South. The problem is a large and serious one and will require the patient help, sympathy, and advice of our most patriotic citizens, North and South, for years to come. I believe that if the principles which I have tried to indicate are followed, a solution of the question will come. So long as the Negro is permitted to get an education, acquire property, and secure employment, and is treated with respect in the business or commercial world, as is now true in the greater part of the South, I shall have the greatest faith in his working out his own destiny in our Southern states. The education and preparing for citizenship of nearly 8 millions of people is a tremendous task, and every lover of humanity should count it a privilege to help in the solution of a great problem for which our whole country is responsible. And that is the end of Booker T. Washington's thoughts about the future of the Negro, of the American Negro. I feel like Booker T. Washington was making a lot of excuses and he didn't want to tell us his true thoughts about lynching. He wanted to quote others. He wanted to talk about other people. How can we help anybody else if we can't even help ourselves? The forecast says, how can we help anybody else if we can't even help ourselves? We can't. You can't help anybody else if you can't help yourself. You can't. You can't help anybody else if you can't help yourself. It's not possible. And if you don't have the wherewithal to stand your ground, then how can you possibly assert your rights if you don't have an enforcement mechanism? Many people have said that Martin Luther King's peaceful methods only worked because Malcolm X existed and the Deacons for Defense were protecting Martin. So you have to remember that peaceful protests only work because there's violence backing it up. You can't sit here and say that, oh, you just need to have a peaceful protest if there's no economic penalty or violent penalty. Then unfortunately, you aren't going to have any movement forward on your issue. If we can't take care of ourselves and feed ourselves and we're not doing business with each other, we can't help anybody else. You know, Booker T. Washington had beautiful, lofty ideas, I guess, for some people. I know it rang melodic in the ears of white folks because they felt like, oh, he's not telling them to go after social rights, but he was in favor of poll testing. That is poll testing and property ownership in a country where we are all subject to the law, in a country where we were all born here with certain inalienable rights, as they like to quote. He was in favor of only giving the franchise to people that could pass a test, black or white, or people that own property, black or white. So, all right, guys. Tomorrow I'm going to be reading The Talented Tenth by W.E.B. Du Bois. We're going to read just some random articles for the rest of this week. And then next week, we'll start fresh with Negro Pilgrimage. But yeah, tomorrow we're going to read The Negro Pilgrimage by no, excuse me. We're going to read The Talented Tenth, an article by W.E.B. Du Bois. I thank each and every one of you. I want to thank Sister Raw and the elders listening with her, and thank you so much for all of your support. Thank you, Anthony McPhail. Thank you, Forecast, for coming in. I know that Oni Tase from the Pro Black Perspective is listening. I know that Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast is listening. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that Afro Native is listening, and so many others. I know that the children from Jesse's Kids Daycare are listening. I know that the children from the Daycare Ladies Network are listening, and I know that the people from the Coffee Shop Cafe are listening. Oh, and Tinkerbell 87, thank you so much. All right. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I will see you tomorrow. And yes, we're going to read The Talented Tenth because he was allegedly talking about a group of people. And, you know, there are a lot of allegations about The Talented Tenth and what they were supposed to do and what they actually did. And we're going to see what he said, to see if what he said, if what if it rings true, if what we read rings true to how it has been applied in modern terms. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.